In this episode, we are going to go over Neilsen Norman Group's 6 maturity models and discuss key indicators to look for or to try to achieve next. So, Katie, today, what are we going to talk about?
Andrew, I think we should talk about maturity models today and how to know how mature your enterprise is in terms of their user experience.
Right. And I think the first thing to cover is we're going to be discussing the Neilsen Norman Group maturity models. There's 6 of them, and it's out on their website. I'll put a link in the description. And you can take a test. They have a test out there to see where you're at with your company. And we're just adding some other indicators or thoughts on what might be in the maturity, different maturity levels.
Definitely. And these are just based on our experiences too, right? So there may be other signs or indicators, and we'd love to hear from all of you listening if you've noticed some other indicators or signs of maturity across these various levels as well.
Yeah, definitely comment or send us your thoughts if you measure something different than us.
Definitely.
All right, so let's start with 1.
Number 1. Yeah, let's start at the bottom, shall we?
So Neilsen Norman Group, they call this one absent, and the short description is UX is ignored or non-existent. So Katie, what would you say is some other indicators?
Yeah, I think for me, absent even goes a little further into like the absence of uh understanding, right? The definition of user experience or what that could encompass. So indicators to me are seeing things like, oh, we upgraded the version, right, of this website. We made a UX change, right? It's a better UX, and not really qualifying that with anything beyond that we've made an upgrade, right? I also tend to think of with enterprise UX, absent is also the absence of the idea of even having employees that could be users. So not even having that idea be communicated or thought of or said out loud that maybe our employees could actually be users. No design thinking. I mean, that's another one. And of course, design thinking can come across in so many different ways, right, Andrew? We've seen this in our experiences, but just an absence of it, right? Just complete absence of this really user focused thought process. So I guess those are my 3 major indicators. I think in my experience, thankfully I haven't seen a lot of this at this level, but it's really more that absence of knowledge of the definition that I have seen and kind of clarifying what does that actually mean to have user experience happening in your org.
Yeah, I think we'd say a phrase at our old place of employment, which was, the build it and they will come mentality, and not really meeting the users where they were at and building what they wanted. I seem to remember us talking about that, and I definitely see that today as well. I come from an IT background, not to pick on IT, but you tend to think about the systems more than the people. I don't have much to add. I think you covered a lot. I mean, absent is, it's not there, or it sounds like a little bit of misunderstood. I actually came up with another concept of maybe a 0.9, where it might even be hostile, right?
Oh, yes.
So my thought here was maybe somebody tried something like UX or it didn't go well, or they had some past experience that was bad, or even they associate UX with maybe agile, and agile is not adopted or looked on favorably, and so they get everything mixed up. So I kind of thought, like, there's absent, but there's also the hostility against UX that can also happen, where either people don't see the value or they tie it to these other concepts.
Yeah, and I've seen that hostility too, where there's again this misunderstanding about what user experience is, and they think it's just design, right? And we're just saying, oh, we can make it look better, or oh, we can do this or we can do that, and they think of it as purely cosmetic, and that makes them hostile, right? Because it's sort of like saying, hey, your baby's ugly, right? And we want to fix it, right? Because people don't like how it looks. When in fact, what we're really doing is saying, hey, this might actually be the perfect solution, right? But we don't know until we actually talk to some people who are using it or going to use it. So I've seen that hostility too, where it's just they've had a bad experience, like you said, they maybe don't trust the concepts, they don't know much about them, and they kind of get a little defensive, right, about maybe their project or their vision of what is supposed to be happening.
Yeah. We'll cover change management in a different episode, but this is
Yes.
great. It's a great segue. I just want to go into that, but let's stay on target. Let's go to limited. Um, so limited is UX work is rare, but done haphazardly and lacks importance.
Yeah, so Andrew, I'd love to hear from you first. What are some indicators you've seen of limited maturity?
Yeah, so you covered hostility in like the absent or point nine hostile. I just remember when starting off at the company we began UX in, we were on the enterprise, but there was products and services out there, and the guy running that side, a guy named Mike, talked about how they were often brought in to make the baby look pretty or something, and he called it sprinkling the magic fairy dust.
Right.
And he was really frustrated because he's like, they just keep bringing us in after the fact to come and make it look pretty. So to me, that's where limited. It's like they're using it, but they only bring it in after the fact, or just don't really understand what true UX is. So again, they're confusing that with design. So I would say that's kind of some of my indicators. The other one is, maybe they focus on accessibility, which is a part of UX, or they focus on just very narrow topics. Don't get me wrong, though, accessibility is really important. So it'd be great if they were at this level. It's very ad hoc. It's kind of not structured very well, and just done. And this isn't necessarily like a bad place to be. I had a customer that brought me in, wanted UX. And really, she had already identified her problem. She had already reached out and talked to these users, and kind of knew what she needed to do. So really, she was looking for a solution to after she had gathered the data. So she'd really already done some qualitative one-on-one sessions without even really knowing she had done it. And that she already had the data, so all I could offer was like either structure another study or something. But she had enough to keep going.
Yeah, that's such a good point. It's not necessarily a bad thing. And I would say some of my indicators on the limited side is that UX is happening, right? But it's happening in pockets, right? It's not yet been diffused into these other functions, right? Or areas. Maybe it's sort of been born and is being, nurtured within a software development organization, or in a, like in our experience, right, in some of these service organizations within an enterprise, but they're still isolated, right? And they're maybe doing things at their own pace, right, is maybe a nice way of saying it, and maybe not as organized as it could be. And the other thing I would say with limited is maybe it's not even being called user experience, because we talked about how that term is sort of misunderstood, but also can sometimes elicit defensiveness from people. So these little groups that might be doing UX, they might be calling it something else, right? They might be trying to make these improvements for their users by not fully owning that, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
And if I were to actually go back and think, when we were building this out at the company, like how we started, I had my direct line manager was like, hey, you want to look into this, go for it. And I was probably doing, some user research part-time. I started off with like surveys and things like that. But it was part-time on top of my other job.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. And I know for me too, it was like I was a human factors engineer for years, right? And a manager of human factors engineers, because they didn't know what title to give us. And other common titles, right, for doing this type of work could be things like product design, right? it could be other engineering, systems engineering. I mean, it could be all sorts of different things, right? Could be marketing titles, but really it's what the people are actually doing in terms of the work is user experience. So that's another good indicator, I think, for the limited.
All right, let's move on to Emergent.
So what's our definition on emergent?
So Neilsen Norman Group defines Emergent as the UX work is functional and promising, but done inconsistently and inefficiently. So I thought this one would be like when I went from part-time to full-time, and I really got the support of a director who created a team. So he created a manager of UX. He made me the lead of UX, and it kind of branched out to another level up. And we started making plans on how do we convince our CTO to go ahead and grow this area. So that's where I was thinking in my journey where this would come in. So I was full time. We were just starting to do real research. I mean, I did research full time at that. Definitely, we were brought into failing projects,
Sure.
or on a whim, someone being like, "Oh, let's bring UX in," and not really knowing what that meant. So it was definitely we were out there trying to sell ourselves a little bit and just relying on the upper management too to get us tied into projects that they were vested in.
Yeah, such a good point, and such a good reminder too of how emergent can look differently. When I was thinking of emergent, I was actually thinking a little bit differently. I was thinking more about how does the term UX kind of become more emergent in an organization. I think what you're saying actually really definitely applies to that. In my mind, it's sort of like that wave you ride when people start to see the value of an experienced user experience designer doing design, right, for a product, and it becomes really obvious, right, how different that product without a designer looks. And so that gains like some momentum, right? You start to sort of fit some other real end-to-end UX, right, into that journey. And so I was thinking more about some of that, in my experience. And of course, we came in at really different times too. So I was thinking more about it as, hey, like, we see this value of design because it's obvious to us, it's visual. People say it looks better. We're getting positive feedback. Can we do more? Can we do more of that? So it's still not really understanding what it is, but sort of starting to ride that wave, right, of positive feedback on how something is looking.
I think the only thing I have to add to that is somewhere around this time frame we were tied to change management, and as we were hiring our own researchers, we actually teamed up with, we weren't getting approved enough funding for the amount of researchers we wanted. So we sort of worked with change management to also put out requests for researchers so that we could kind of work together to build up. But they had us, they were separate org, slightly different look, vision of what they wanted.
Yeah,
Right.
I remember that. That's a good ad.
Yeah. All right, let's go ahead and move to number 4, which is structured.
Yes.
Neilsen Norman Group defines this as the organization has semi-systematic UX-related methodology that is widespread with varying degrees of effectiveness and efficiency.
That feels very real to me. That feels like a really good definition. I think this is also like the exciting part in the maturity journey, though, because this is when, you've been there for 0.9 or 1, 2, 3, and you start to get to 4 into that structured, right? You're starting to see signs almost from the top down, in my opinion, as an indicator that UX is important, right? So I remember kind of UX being put into official process documents, right? And it didn't at all guarantee that anyone was going to do it, but it was there. It was written down, and we could point to it and we could say, look, this is part of how we do business, right? This is part of our structure. So I feel like that's that moment where like the tides kind of start to turn, and you're getting like that top down support and the bottom up, and things are starting to slowly meet in the middle. Also, another indicator for me here is just seeing teams that are formed specifically around UX tasks and jobs. So you mentioned that in the emergent phase, right, we're kind of starting to get these like empowerments, right, or opportunities to make this more of a center part of the work. And then in structured, I feel like it's maybe even getting to the point where people are specifically hired for that job, right, to build out a team, where they have, and their job really is UX, right, not just like saying it's UX, or having to sneak it in. So I think those are two big indicators for me. I also feel like, and Andrew, I'm curious what you think about this. I also feel like at this point in my journeys, this is where I've seen VPs or upper level leadership sort of own UX as a capability. Maybe it's not perfect, but there's some sort of leadership level that's helping get UX into those process documents, or get, a little more of that structure started.
Yeah, so I wrote down leadership support, so C and C minus one. And really making it into the decision making. So you mentioned like baking it into something. So I'd like to give an example of that, that we saw, which is trade studies. So, trade studies were done on new products or capabilities that we wanted to bring into the enterprise. And now we had a little, UX line item in the trade studies. So that was one of the indicators for that. Yeah, I put also maybe a dedicated UX manager, which I did kind of reference in Emergent too. That's just another good example.
Yeah. I love that reminder about the trade studies. Maybe we'll have to do a special deep dive on that for our listeners, because I feel like that was one of like my proudest moments in building a user experience organization for enterprise, right? It was actually getting us involved and kind of the steps of doing that.
Yep.
When we were still so new, right? Because I think that's one of those critical areas for enterprise UX. So maybe we'll do another episode on that.
Yeah, trade study. And then the other thing that you made me think of is we started getting tied into mission assurance and quality assurance,
quality,
and the SMO, Service Management Office in IT. Actually the Service Management Office started for us a little earlier. But I don't think we started seeing results or changes to the Service Management Office process until about this stage. We had a little bit more oomph behind us, you might say. And our CTO was the one who started investing. And then he's also the one that kind of decided to own the SMO process at that point. Many reorgs later, we were then under the COO, but that's where it started, basically.
Yeah, that's definitely a good deep dive we could do.
Yeah.
Want to move on to integrated?
Sure. So integrated, Neilsen Norman Group defines it as UX work is comprehensive, effective, and pervasive.
That effective one gets me every time, because that's the real kicker, right? Would you like to share some of your indicators that you see first?
So I put this as the culture, like, of the company.
Yeah,
they start to understand what UX is. And a big shout out. I've just been revisiting this phase and thinking about like, how did we do this? We actually started, in the beginning, sending out a book called Don't Make Me Think by Steve Krug, which is a really easy read. It's got cartoons. I think it brings UX to a textbook. Honestly, it's very popular. So we started sending that out to C-levels, any customer, and then I even got the director of custom applications. She made it as part of every new hire, got a copy of the book and read it. They might not have got their own copy. They might have shared a copy at an office, right? But new hires were just handed the book on day one. And while they're getting all their access and stuff, they could read through it. So you really started to build up, this knowledge of what UX truly was. Yeah. So I put culture of UX. I put cross-functional team. To me, this is a big one. This is where, we talked a lot about research and some about design, but you also have your developers. And as you get outside of UI design, who are your designers? So in this case, cross-functional of having your researcher your designer and your developer, all on the same page, collaborating, taking that data and being innovative together, and respecting each other's, area of expertise. So in a process, instead of having a UI designer, you would have a process designer like Six Sigma, or someone who's an expert there. So I have a cross-functional team, really understanding how to incorporate the different roles and have them collaborate and work together and have a lot of fun, honestly, too. And even though, like in that case, process, I'm talking about process designers. Everyone's still visual, so it's still good to create visual artifacts for your C levels and directors and whatnot.
Absolutely.
And I put UX measured as a KPI, so key performance indicator. So it's starting to make its way into, CSAT is now a measurement, right? Which is a whole topic on its own. But, you start to see that they're incorporating this into success criteria. And then UX just not being UI, which I just kind of covered with the processes. And thinking of processes, you could think of governance, think of strategy, these kind of things, and starting to emerge into that area.
Love it. And I totally agree on the culture piece. I had on my notes for this, I had UX as part of the team, right? And this is like the mantra and like the whole feeling, right, that we all have as UXers, no matter where you work. It's like, am I part of the team, right? So I love what you said about that cross-functional aspect. It's like, do they need me here? Do they want me here, right? And are we providing value together? I also think another point would just be that UX is expected at this level of maturity, right? It's not optional. It's not like, oh, do we need UX to make this brand new software product? Do we need UX to make this decision? It's just part of how we're operating, right? And people, I think back to that culture aspect, they want us there because we're going to provide that different perspective.
Yeah, and I think that just because I talked about the SMO before, the service management office, this is where we were built in, like when service changes were being done. Let's say you were changing conference software from one vendor to another. They asked, okay, how are you communicating that to the users? Change management also involved there. And then how are you displaying that? Getting, what's the whole user experience of that change as well.
And something else that we introduced that I believe is still happening, which is great, is what is it like after it's been introduced, right? What's that feedback loop measurement like? How do we know it's working as intended? How do we know we need to make a change, right? So I think that whole life cycle of feedback really is crucial.
Yeah, we started doing periodic audits on the main systems. So on one really important one that everyone would use to get all their services, every quarter there was a usability study where all the service lines making different things could submit ideas of like, hey, in this study, can you include this scenario, right? I would like to see how this is done. And then if it got too overwhelming for like a quarterly review of the whole area, a whole website, then there could be one-off focus studies.
Yeah, and I actually love this as a transition to the sixth level of the maturity to being user driven, because I think there's a distinction here between being part of like the very tactical, right, but still very important parts of the enterprise organization. But then there's the strategic side, right? And for me, the transition between 5 and 6 is really from that practical, impactful, strategic or tactical driven, product driven decision making to strategic at level 6.
Yeah, and so let's define level 6 real quick, which is user driven. Dedication to UX at all levels leads to deep insights and exceptional user centered design outcomes.
Yeah, more tactical at 5. And then for me, this is where UX becomes part of the big decisions, right? We don't make big decisions as a company for our employees, right? Let's keep this enterprise focused. We don't make these decisions without having UX impact, right? And when I think of big decisions, I think of financial implications, right? I think of impactful changes, right, which may or may not have financial consequences. Uh, for example, right, replacing entire systems that employees have used every day forever with something brand new. We don't do that, right, unless UX is involved. So I think taking it beyond maybe these like smaller, pieces that help keep the organization running, and pushing it to that strategic level. To me, that's just the biggest sign of this top level of maturity.
Yeah, and another indicator I think at the very top is you have like a C-level senior executive representing UX.
Right.
Um, that's to me a big one. Mostly, because change is constant, and if you're still under like a CIO or COO, and that person leaves that you've spent all this time, teaching or whatever, and you get somebody else in, they might not have the same understanding of what UX is and decide it's something else. And then you're starting kind of like this whole knowledge management journey, where if you had somebody in that role, you'd expect them to hire somebody who knows what what UX is, and they can help mentor their peers or have that voice there.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that one. I love how you put that. And for that person too, right, in that leadership role, to be able to ask partners outside of the enterprise, right, or external partners even, or providers, to actually talk about how they manage UX and what their UX process is, and to be educated enough to know if those two processes that are internal for, and have become our expectations, right, for our company, match, right, if we're going to an external provider for something.
Yep. So they can be there advocating, like you said, at the strategic level. You know, I remember some stuff being sent up to the board of directors for the big KPI goals, right? And making sure we had some folks up there, representing. Um, in all honesty, I haven't been in at work yet that had that indicator, so it's just me wistfully looking. We had our CIO and our COO doing that, but I do see a risk of not having that dedicated role out there.
Yeah, we're trying to make it part of some other role, right? Like, I think to your point, it's its own role, and it should be its own role at this level of maturity, right?
Yeah. Yep. So at 5, if it's still combined with CIO, CTO, etc., I would say that's a good indicator. You might still be at a 5. But if you have that dedicated role, it's a great indicator that you're at a 6.
Mm-hmm.
And then as far as you're talking about strategy, we should have stuff being presented, at the board of director level, brought into the strategy discussions. So, one way we would get data is through like a project management office or program management office, PMO. And then, once that data, that's really coming from, the managers and the executives of these different areas of the company. And then having that balanced out or looked into by a research team on the ground, right? Stuff like that.
100%. Yeah. And even more specifically, right, that those decision makers at the top, right, are informing their decisions and prioritizing, right, their list of to do based on that really reliable UX research, really, right? So the way in which we execute on those things should continue to be people driven, right, user driven, but to actually make their decisions, right, they're not relying on themselves or hearsay, right, to make these decisions. They're informing their choices based on this data.
Right. They're taking that kind of creative innovation energy that they're probably getting, but also like balancing that out. Because I definitely saw in the past some folks at the top that would just say, "Okay, here's what we're doing because this is what I think," and then if they left and somebody else came in, I mean, just you're getting jerked around basically in different directions as a priority shift. I also saw in the past KPIs or goals that were set that when they were brought down to the level of solution architect or to actually go execute. They didn't really make sense as much to like what, you go talk to your managers. They're saying, well, I see where they're going with that, but this to me is much more important. And so they didn't have a say, right? And so you'll see less and less of that kind of talk. It'll be like, yes, this is the goal. Yes, this is important. Now, we had input here. So at least, even if they don't think it's the right priority, they at least, had the say and are already geared toward getting the goal done.
Yeah, I mean, if you were going to have a mature, user-centered, people-driven enterprise, you got to leave your ego out of it, right? There's no room for ego in a people-driven enterprise environment. So in order to do that, right, you have to become less biased. You have to recognize your own biases, right? You have to build this structure, right? Like we've just been talking through all these levels of maturity in which you can rely, right, on that feedback and on that information to inform your choices, right? Which of course are going to have multiple areas of data and variables coming in, but this is one big piece of it, right, for a mature organization.
Right. Yeah. I think that's important what you just said there. Like your data, you're going to have analytics and different kinds of data coming in. Yep. It's not going to be all, data directly from people in your org. You might be looking at the industry, and maybe this would come from people like an architect or someone who's tracking that part of the industry. They have their own data. They're bringing that in. You're also bringing in the user data and like the data from your internal employees, and using that all together in a plan to make good decisions.
Love that.
So anything else that we didn't cover?
I think the only thing I would just leave people with on maturity models is that there's variation, right, in every organization, and you may be in some ways super mature. Maybe you've got the right person in the right role, and then in other ways you still feel behind. I think it would be ridiculous, right, to have people walk away from this thinking like, oh, we all need to be at a level 6 to be successful, because I think that could look differently. So just know that if you're in an organization and you're trying to do user experience and you're trying to do the right thing, number one, it takes time, but number two, success might look differently for you than this strict model, right? So it's important to use this model as a way to see where you're at, communicate opportunities with leadership and peers, but it's also okay to have your own measures of success, right, for where you're at in your UX journey.
Yeah, and that's definitely, if people are out there that have their own measurements, love to hear them. Yes. This is a conversation, right? This is a journey we're all on. So,
absolutely.
I think you just reminded me of something I put in here, and I didn't mention it because I'm not sure where I sit on this, but whether you need a centralized UX org or if a decentralized but highly coordinated UX groups. But that's something to just keep in mind. There's a process model, CMMI, where different processes you're measuring, saying, oh, this process is at this maturity and this process is at this maturity. So your company, whether it's an enterprise, product and services, consulting, different aspects might be at different maturities. And they might be wildly different too. Yeah. And that's, so like you might have one whole section of the company that really understands, what UX is, and they're at that higher maturity level, and another part that, barely knows what it is.
So true. Yeah, it can really vary. And I would love to dive deeper for our listeners on the whole centralized versus dispersed structures as well. I have lots of opinions on this. So
okay.
I would love to share those and
I'm undecided.
Well, that's cool. That'll be helpful for me because I feel like I have way too many opinions, actually.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that wraps us up.
Okay.